Howdy, I'm Kate Kavanaugh, and you're listening to the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, where we're laying the groundwork for our land, ourselves, and for generations to come by looking at the way every thread of life is connected to one another. Communities above ground mirror the communities below the soil, which mirror the vast community of the cosmos. As the saying goes, as above, so below. Join me as we take a curious journey into agriculture, biology, history, spirituality, health, and so much more. I can't wait to unearth all of these incredible topics alongside you. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Groundwork podcast, which I am ever so slowly migrating over from the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast, which still bears this title on iTunes and Spotify. So I'll get there eventually. Hi, I am your host, Kate Kavanaugh, and it is such a pleasure to be here with you, exploring the threads of what it means to be humans woven into this earth. I have been a very threadbare human these last few weeks, the last month or so, and I think that the going-ons of the last 19 months hit me, and they hit me hard, and I just kind of collapsed. And one of the things that I think is really important to celebrate on this podcast is that we are humans, and there are times in which it is hard for us to produce in the way that we have come to talk about producing content, producing work. And I kind of fell down a little bit in a lot of different ways, which is something that I'm exploring in some writing, and I'm exploring in some ways that we're going to bring back to the podcast, because it's always interesting to take those experiences that we have in life and try to open them up a little bit. But I am coming back to life here, and I am really excited to be here with you and really excited to bring you this episode of the podcast. I think that the guest that we have today, Rose George, might be one of my favorite nonfiction authors. Her books, 9 Pints, which is all about human and animal blood, 90% of everything about the shipping industry that brings us 90% of everything in our lives. The Big Necessity, which is about waste, human waste in particular, and a life removed, which is about refugees. She's a fantastic writer who is really able to balance levity and gravity. I have a written intro for this, which is something that I've been trying out. So we're just going to dive in and go from there. I want to thank you for being here with me. If you enjoy this podcast, share it with someone. Really helps. We're going to dive in. So I was first recommended the work of Rose George by my friend James Connolly, who is a frequent source for books on this podcast. And I picked up 90% of Everything, which is Rose George's book about the goods that are shipped to us and the shipping industry and sailors that provide us with those goods last fall. I ruminated a lot on that book and the idea, as Rose puts it, that, quote, the more ships have grown in size and consequence, the less space they take up in our imagination, end quote, which feels so true for so many parts of our world. Many of you know that I've been on a mission to look at the ubiquitous and yet unseen underpinnings of our world, something I frame in this podcast as the waters that we swim in. There are things like sand, roads, sewers, trucking, shipping, phosphorus, and the many, many human hands that move these things across the globe. Rose's work speaks to really seeing all of these things and also seeing these people. I came back around to Rose's work looking to explore the end of supply chains, that is, waste streams, and wanting to start with human waste in particular. I want to put a little note on this that Rose and I do use a word with some frequency on this episode that might be interpreted as a, quote, bad word. I don't know if I believe in that. And I just want to tell you this. This is your warning to gird any delicate ears now, though I would implore you to hear that we use the word with a lot of neutrality. And Rose, in fact, argues for the use of this word. We explore shit, that of humans and some of animals, and just what we're doing with it. Rose's book, The Big Necessity, caught me off guard. I came looking to learn about waste streams, but what I found was a passion, and I mean a real passion, for toilets, for sanitation, and what it might mean to reimagine our sewer systems. I also got a chance to learn about the history of sewers and unlocked a new dream. I am dying to tour a sewer in London or New York City. So if you could make that come true, please reach out. Rose illuminated something invisible to me and I think a lot of the Western world, which is that while politicians and celebrities and NGOs might focus on the idea that we need to provide clean water, they often ignore that the upstream problem is the pollution of water by human waste. And I think that this illustrates something we frequently don't look for, which are the problems upstream of the ones that are right in front of us, that are often too complex and too messy, both literally and figuratively, to want to dig into. Rose navigates all kinds of those problems in her work, and certainly in this book, The Big Necessity, deftly, compassionately, and with an incredible sense of humor. She has a chapter on Toto washlets that frankly delighted me and quickly became one of my favorite chapters of any book that I have ever read. In many ways, I think as a farmer, I'm a little bit inured to the idea of shit. One must give up any preciousness or disgust response to shit in order to farm contentedly. More than that, however, I find that shit is the very basis of life. Rose recounts a quote of Steven Pinker: "To be uninterested in the public toilet is to be uninterested in life." And I might amend that to say, to be uninterested in shit is to be uninterested in life. Shit and death and blood, which Rose also wrote a book about, Nine Pints, which is also incredible, are the ingredients that give soil the necessary ingredients for life. Phosphorus, nitrogen, potassium, microbes, minerals, and all manner of those ingredients are what nourish gardens, grasses, forests, and beyond. We need shit. It's anything but waste. Shit is life. We speak broadly in this episode about sanitizing language, and I think we've sanitized and hidden so many things. It's just unpalatable to think about the pallets of goods that come to our door in the Amazon truck, the tons of shit that we evacuate from our bowels. I think we spend about 3 years on the toilet, according to Rose, and the sewer system into the ocean, the massive cargo ships traversing the world, disrupting migratory patterns of whales and fish, the blood, which, as it turns out, is the 13th most widely traded commodity in the world, which I never could have guessed, that ends up in the underwear of girls and women the world over, some of whom are considered dirty during their period because of it and put at great risk. Something that Rose really explores in her book, Nine Pints. But it is speaking about these very things that feel so taboo that begins to change it. It's when we peek at the unseen and give really seeing it a go that change begins to catalyze. In some ways, I have this hope for us that may we all become champions of toilets and periods and menstruation products and reducing the goods that we ship to our doorsteps. May we all see, if even for a moment, the waters that we swim in, and indeed the idea that shit is a prerequisite for life. Rose has 4 books. I've read them all at least once, and I recommend them very highly. We don't cover the details of those books in this podcast as much as we just talk about what it means to see the unseen. But each book is worth a read and are incredibly rewarding to boot. Rose also has an incredible Substack where she shares her life with aplomb and vulnerability, which I kind of talked about at the beginning of this introduction. She has an incredible way of weaving in her own musings on grief, her own musings of aging, her life as a runner, and some fun animal facts and other bits and bobs as well. I am so excited to host Rose, and I am so excited to continue these explorations of seeing the unseen and yet ubiquitous underpinnings of this world. I really hope that you find something interesting or something that grabs you here in this podcast, and if you enjoy it, might I encourage you to share it. That is how people find new podcasts for the most part, and it helps this little podcast gain some growth. And if you wanted to leave a rating and review, that also really helps, and I deeply appreciate it. I read every single one, and always on offer is if you leave a written review and shoot me a little snapshot of it, I will send you a little piece of snail mail, which we all love getting mail, in return. I want to thank our sponsors. This podcast would not be possible, especially through the last couple of sticky months, without our incredible sponsors, Redmond Real Salt and Sundry's Farm, whose incredible garlic is going to begin shipping in September. And so your support of these really awesome American businesses helps me, helps this podcast, and nourishes you because they both offer really delicious products that we use almost every day. So thanks to our sponsors, Sundry's Farm and Redmond Real Salt. And without further ado, here is Rose George. Tie in a little bit with what I believe you're working on, which you don't need to talk about, but I think that this might be kind of a fun entry point of taking a really broad stroke of all of your incredible books and some sort of thematic elements that emerged as I read and reread all of them, which has been a delight. I just think it's so great. And so I'm actually going to start with a little David Foster Wallace quote that he had doing a commencement speech many years ago. He said, "There are these two young fish swimming along, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, 'Morning, boys, how's the water?' And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, 'What the hell is water?' He goes on to say, the immediate point of the fish story is that the most obvious, ubiquitous, important realities are often the ones that are the hardest to see and talk about. And this is something that I think you do so beautifully. You take these realities, these taboos, these pieces of our life that are incredibly ubiquitous and necessary and yet unseen, and you see them. And so I wanted to start here and see if that resonated with you.
That's a great quote. And yes, I have just sent in a book about fish. But yeah, I mean, I often get called like intrepid or investigative, and flattering though both those adjectives are, I don't think they're appropriate for what I do, because I don't think any of the taboos or invisible things that I write about, I think they're all in plain sight. I mean,
Yes.
A toilet. We all spend years of our life on a toilet, in a bathroom.
3 years, which I learned from you.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure about that, but yeah. So yeah, that wasn't difficult to go and find out about sanitation and toilets. I mean, it was really easy because the people who work in that industry feel so ignored and undervalued that they were just delighted to talk about it. So that was just easy. But shipping is the other one, I guess, that people say, the invisible industry. I mean, it is invisible because the high seas are invisible because no one can get there. But again, it's not. That is a bit harder because it's very hard for people to get into ports these days because of security concerns. But it's not impossible to figure out that all your stuff came to you somehow. and someone must have brought it to
Yes.
you, and then maybe do a bit of thinking about it. So again, no, that's actually an inappropriate example because it is very hard to get on a container ship and it is very hard to get into ports, and you do have to make a big effort to do that. But again, I don't compare my. I don't think I'm intrepid like a war correspondent or someone like that. I just,
Mm.
go down sewers or to slums or things that people do every day, like
Mhm.
thousands or millions of people do every day. It's just that it's a question of like that David Foster Wallace quote, it's a question of seeing and
Yeah.
choosing to see more importantly. So choosing to acknowledge how the world works, I think is probably maybe that's a good
Mm.
description of what I try to do, I suppose.
I think that's really beautiful because I think that so much of your work is also just what undergirds our life. To me, shipping is one of those things, and I've heard you call this sea blindness.
Mm,
It undergirds modern life, and toilets, going to the bathroom are obviously this necessity, or the
mm.
world of blood, and I think menstruation in particular, and the way that this affects so many people. And I think the more I read, the I want to ask you, was there a moment in which you made a conscious choice to see these things? Like, how do we choose to see them? Because so often I think they are obfuscated in a lot of different ways, even just in the language that we use to speak about them.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I'll talk book by book because people look at my body of work and think, how on earth does someone get from, you know, refugees in Liberia to writing about a trauma ward in a London hospital? But um, I mean, my first book was suggested to me by the publisher, so I didn't really. That wasn't one of my ideas. But again, it was about. I think the thing that drove me throughout that book was, why is one person leaving a country called an exile, and why are refugees always seen as a kind of mass, and why can we not
Mm.
distinguish,
Oh,
why cannot so I was just trying to individualize people's stories and just tell people's stories in that book. And then the sanitation book, that was a bit of a cheat because I was working for Colors magazine and we did a book called Cacas, which was lots of pictures of animal poo. And we just had these little snippets of stories alongside them. And I basically stole some of those snippets and made a whole book out of them because one of them was the fact that 2.6 billion people didn't have a toilet. And I found that so mind blowing
yeah,
in
I found that
itself.
mind blowing too.
In itself, mind blowing, but also the fact that I had got to the age I had got to and I had no idea about that
Yeah,
at all. And I'd never read it and I'd never come across it. And it was just something that was absolutely not in my consciousness because it didn't have to be in my consciousness because I grew up in a well plumbed country.
yeah. I think I've heard you call it the flushed and plumbed world,
Yeah.
and how much we don't see that. I think at the time of writing, it was 40% of people do not have a toilet.
Yeah. And even of those 40%, a lot of that will not be adequate sanitation. So a lot of that might just be, a latrine with no privacy or something like that. I'm not sure of the latest figures, but I mean, it's improved since I wrote the book, but not as much as you'd hope. Um, but actually, the sanitation book actually gave rise to the blood book, which is, so there is a bit of correlation, and the shipping book gave rise to the fishing book. So um,
Mhm.
the sanitation book, I briefly looked at the fact that girls were not going to, they were dropping out of school because they didn't have toilets. To change, sanitary pads or sanitary cloths or whatever they had, if they had anything. Um, and when the book came out, I began to write much more about, excuse me, what's called menstrual hygiene. I don't like that phrase, but it's called menstrual hygiene. And so I wrote a lot about that. I worked for a UN agency, sort of consulting about that. I wrote a booklet for them. I worked with WaterAid quite a bit, and I began to think I'd quite like to write a book about this, but I really didn't want it to be a book about just about menstruation because I knew that that would have a limited audience readership.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I also started thinking, how come we think like a blood transfusion, we think of it as such an unalloyed good that people actually demand it in hospitals. And yet, another blood product, which is menstrual blood, which has tissue in it, okay, but it is blood, is just
Mhm.
seen as something so dirty it has to be hidden. So that was the diving board that I leapt off of, which was why is that good and why is that bad? How have we got to this point where one is and it was so fascinating, and I had no idea when I started writing Nine Pints that actually that donation of blood is much more complicated than anyone thinks. We think of it as this kind of pure dose of blood, and it's nothing like a pure dose of blood. It's been fractionated, it's been obviously treated, which is good, but it's not whole blood, and I don't think people realize that.
Yeah.
Um,
Or that it's the 13th, this blew my mind, the 13th widest traded commodity.
Plasma is the 13th widest
Yeah,
trade. Yeah,
plasma.
plasma.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, that is blood. That is part of blood. You're right. But yeah, I mean that's largely thanks to the United States that it is such a widely traded commodity. But yeah, it was fascinating to kind of look around the world and see how people treat blood differently as a product, or as a, like in the UK, it's seen as a kind of sacred thing in a way that it's absolutely, you do not sell it, and you do not pay people to give their blood. And yet in the US there is much not blood donation but plasma. Everyone sells their plasma, and it's
Mhm.
not a societal no in the way that it is in this country. So that's really, I mean, how can two countries be so different? Two similar,
Yeah.
rich industrialized countries, and yet have completely different attitudes towards the same product. It was really fascinating.
As we explore this episode with Rose George and the necessity of fertilizers, I want to talk about one of our sponsors, Sundry's Farm Garlic, and the incredibly spectacular way that former podcast guest Rob Kropfel and Jillian Lakuski grow their garlic. For over 8 years, perched above the Snake River in the Hagerman Valley of Idaho, Rob and Jillian have hand tended their garlic. They care for the soil with practices of rotating the garlic and using fertilizers like blood meal, fish emulsion, and kelp with no additional herbicides or pesticides. This garlic is planted, weeded, scapes are picked, harvested, trimmed, and shipped by hand. In fact, I just received the most beautiful garlic braid from Sundry's farm. The result is the most delicious garlic I've ever had. Sundry's Farm grows both seed and culinary garlic, which is available now with shipping beginning in September. It is certified white rot free, and you can find hard and soft neck varietals like Nootka Rose and Chestnut Red. Sundry's Farm specializes in big cloves, which are my favorite in the kitchen for easy peeling and my favorite in the garden for growing future big cloved garlic that will be easy to peel. You can get yours today by going to sundriesfarm.com and exploring a wide range of varietals and grab bags for both planting and culinary needs at sundriesfarm.com. That's sundriesfarm.com to pre-order seed and culinary garlic for the year with shipping beginning in September. There's no code needed, just have your hankering for some incredible hand-grown garlic ready and in action. I I think it was beautifully done, and there's 2 places I want to take this, and the first is something that you said, that you wanted to bring this to an individualized level. And as I was looking at this and thinking about that sort of quote about the water, I think the other thing that you do really beautifully is you see the fish and you see the people that are a part of this in so many different ways, whether you're looking at refugees or women in countries that don't have access to these menstruation products, various things, or seeing the people that move our goods, not just the ships and the containerization of it, but the people.
Mm.
And so let's start there, because I think that this piece, this individualizing, felt just as important as seeing the water, was seeing these other fish.
Well, it's kind of again, it's a bit of a cheap trick on my part in that I kind of coast on other people's stories. So, but I do what I want my books to be more than anything is readable, and I want them to be readable because I want them to resonate, and I want people to keep turning the page because I want them to read what I've discovered and what I think is important. So they have to be readable, and I think the way you make things readable is you make them vivid. And the way you make things vivid is by getting people to tell you their stories, because people always have stories and most of them are good. And so it's an easy way to get some vivid kind of emotion into often a very, what I write about sometimes is, quite dark things. And I don't want it to just be a constant slap around the face of this is terrible, God, this is terrible, this is terrible. I want it to be this is terrible, this is what we can do about it, this is what this person is doing about it. Things that and that's my ideal. And so a lot of, for example, I think everything has to have humor in it. I don't think I write funny books, but I think humor is really important. And I learned that there wasn't a lot of humor in my first book, but in The Big Necessity, the sanitation book, I really had to think about that because I didn't want it to be a toilet book. So I didn't want it to be dismissed as kind of a funny toilet book, but because I had very serious things to say, but it had to be funny because that's how you get through to people often, is with humor. And so, but a lot of that humor I got from the people I interviewed. So a lot of it was that I interviewed funny people, and I was really lucky to get people like Jack Sim or Joe Madias in Orissa or Steve Sugden, or they were all funny, and it was great. And maybe they were funny because they worked in shit. I don't know. But probably in the Blood book, maybe a bit less so. That was probably a bit less funny, but in 90% of everything, I was so lucky to have the captain that I had on my trip, and it could have been so different. And in fact, when I first got on board, there was another captain who was I found him very chilly and very cold and not particularly friendly. But it turns out he was about to go home, and he'd been on board for 3 months, so he was just knackered and he wasn't interested in talking to me. But then when Glenn came on, Captain Glenn, I was like, oh no, this is going to be fine. Because the first thing he said to me was, I hope you enjoy the ship, which the other captain had never said. And I just realized, and he absolutely saved the book by a long shot, because he was great and he was funny and he was warm and he had stories, and I was really, really lucky that he was the captain on my ship.
He's an incredible character, and I think does just add this depth and humor to the journey. And I know that when I wrote you about this interview, I said that one of the things I really deeply appreciate about your work is the infusion of humor. And I think that, within that, something that you talk a lot about is the sort of sanitization of language that we use, whether we're talking about minstrel products, which you have a great passage where you imagine that in a store, in a pharmacy, that they would, maybe call it, bleeding absorbers or plugs and wads.
I think I stole that from Gloria Steinem. Yeah, but I think that was her passage. But yeah, definitely.
Which I loved, or the way that we sanitize and sort of work around the language of shit, and just how many euphemisms and borrowing from other languages that we have. And just as you were speaking, I wondered a little bit if in some ways humor is a way of providing a doorway to sort of not desanitize, but to talk about things truthfully in a way that sort of eases people into them without putting these guardrails that we put on with language and euphemism.
Yeah, I think
hiding it.
Yeah, I think you're right. Stand-up comedians get away with a lot more than. Can you imagine if they just stood there and had a serious speech and said the same things? They just wouldn't get away with it. But you can get away with a lot if you use humor to get it across. And you're right, I don't really like sanitize. Like I see that euphemism has a place, but I really don't like it. I was at this was funny actually. I was at the allotment. I don't know what you call an allotment, kitchen, like kitchen garden. Anyway, I was at the allotments the
Yeah.
other day, and I walked past this woman and her daughter, and she was sitting on a bench, which was to celebrate someone who's died recently. And I heard this woman say to her daughter, "Yeah, it's for Maggie who's died." And I just went off and did my plot, and then I came back, and the woman was still there, and I said, "I really appreciated you using the word died." And she looked really
Mhm.
shocked, and I was like, "Well, because everybody says past, because it's an
Mhm.
Americanism, and it's actually a very loaded word, past, because it implies that you
Yes.
have a certain belief." Because you think, obviously, if you pass, you're going
Sure.
from one place to another
Yeah.
place.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
And it's just, I mean, there's nothing wrong with the word died. It's just, died is, it doesn't have any value judgment in it. It doesn't, or any belief in it. It's just a statement of fact. And she was quite shocked that I'd brought it up, and I felt a bit weird for doing it. But she was like, "Oh, I think it's because I'm trying to teach my child to speak about things frankly." Like, well, and I thought, well, that's great. But, when she's like, in a couple of years, she's going to be taught to say the word past in school because we've been Americanized over here with I think the US is just crazy about euphemism. And I really, it's peculiar. And one day I'll get to the bottom of it. But, yeah, that was a total aside. But yeah, I don't like the word past for died. I don't like the word,
I don't either.
I mean, in the case of shit, I I mean, there are reasons to use feces or excrement or poop, or and if it's easier to talk to someone if they prefer the word poop, or if they're going to be offended by the word shit, then yeah, it's fine. But I don't like euphemisms that are hiding things. So I don't mind them
Mhm.
if they're just kind of to deal with embarrassment or something like that. But if it's something that has an effect of hiding something and something being discarded from consciousness or something like that, then I don't see. I mean, I'm from Yorkshire, and we're supposed to be quite frank speaking, and I I don't want I don't want to have things hidden just because we don't have the courage to use the appropriate words for them. So
Yeah.
when I did, that was another really big issue with the big necessity was language. And I don't like the word waste either. So I don't like human waste, even though it is actually a subtitle I think it's definitely on the US book. I'm not sure if it's on the UK one. Um, but it's not waste. It doesn't have to be waste. So
No,
it's a
it doesn't.
completely inappropriate word for it. And that word can unleash a load of uh, attitudes towards this problematic substance, which could be different if we use a different word.
Mhm.
So, so I had to think really carefully, but I also didn't want to put people off. So I didn't want to really shock them enough that they would not pick up the book because I wanted them to pick up the book. So I didn't want to have shit in the title, but I was going to use the word shit, and I do try and use it just to not be ashamed of it. I mean, there's nothing wrong with the word shit. But I remember I when I was first, I was asked to kind of audition to do my first TED talk, which was on sanitation. And so I
Mhm.
had to do a kind of pre-TED talk in London, and I did one. And I remember coming off the stage, and Chris Anderson came up to me and he said, "Rose, that was great." He's very enthusiastic. "Rose, that was great." He said, "But less shit, smile more." So for my big TED talk, I did less shit and smiled more, and it seemed to go down well. But he was right, because I had overloaded, and when you overload, you kind of you remove the force of it. So
Mhm.
it's a very difficult balancing act. But I mean, I look back at the big necessity, and I think I got it about right. I think.
If you're enjoying thinking about all of the necessities with Rose George, the ingredients for life, as it were, things like blood and manure and water, then I think you'll love exploring salt with this week's sponsor, Redmond Real Salt. For eons, humans have been led to salt licks by herbivores, and many years ago, that's how Redmond Real Salt found the vein of salt in Utah from which all their salt is mined, right here in America. Salt is critical for our electrolyte balance, and Redmond Real Salt is packed full of 60 plus naturally occurring trace minerals that add to that balance, all while imparting flavor. This is one of the most delicious salts I've ever had. It's earthy and savory and just a tiny bit sweet. The salt packs a punch on my counter as my daily salt, in all the things I'm preserving as we head into the height of summer, and as my absolute must have electrolyte powder. Relight is Redmond's electrolyte powder, and it's balanced with their salt for sodium, potassium, as well as bioavailable magnesium. It has magnesium glycinate in it and is one of the few electrolyte powders to do so, which I think is incredible, alongside a little bit of coconut water powder. It comes in all kinds of flavors. I love the pina colada, and is my favorite way to beat the heat and keep my long walks and workouts fueled. I have been using Redmond Real Salt in my kitchen and at the butcher shop for 5, 6, 7 years, and it is my only salt that I use. So I highly recommend it. I love it, and they're also just an incredible company to work with. You can find Redmond Real Salt products, including their salt, their Relight electrolyte powder, seasonings, and so much more by going to Redmond, REDMOND.life. That's redmond.life. And you can use the code mindbodysoil_15 for 15% off when you go to redmond.life, or you can just go through the link in the show notes. I love their salt, and it is one of the most important ingredients for my life. So, with that, we'll get back to our interview with Rose. I mean, in my account, in the Big Necessity, I read it twice. It was, I think it's an incredible book for so many reasons, for what it illuminates, but also there is a certain joy of exploration in it. I think that chapter on Toto toilets really took me off guard, and how sort of fun and strangely delightful it was, and that it illustrates an important aspect of how quickly the Japanese adopted a very different way of experiencing things. But I think that you do strike the right balance, and I think that the other thing that you did is you illuminate that the language that we use can be obfuscating these things that are so crucial. And I'm glad you said that about died and passed on. That's actually something we've talked about on the podcast. And
Oh,
I think
okay.
it's really important, because it's important to speak honestly about things. And the more our language hides, the more we hide things that need to come into the light, whether that's menstruation or shit or death, all very important aspects of life. And I think one of the pieces I was going to kind of tug at here is, I think in using honest language, you are better able to illuminate this sort of paradoxical quality of a lot of the subjects that you look at, that shit is anything but waste, right? That it's full of phosphorus and nitrogen and things that can help plants grow. It is also full of diseases that can cause massive amounts of diarrhea in children, which you talk about statistically as something we don't really see, and can have this really negative effect on water quality. And so it's kind of holding, and the same with blood, right? I mean, and you even said it, just the way that we view blood donation versus period blood, or the way that blood can carry pathogens or save lives. the way that shipping undergirds our entire life and is yet unseen. And so I think that your honesty in language really helped take down a sort of partition between the paradoxical qualities of so much that you're talking about, if that makes sense.
Mm. And I think you're right. I think there are these hidden spaces, and maybe that behind those partitions. And I think one of the biggest that I mean, not one of the biggest, but one of the most obvious was that when I looked in the shipping context, when I looked into how fair trade works, and fair trade is an actual organization that gives its badge of approval to things, and I asked them, just I think it was an example of coffee, and I said, well, okay, so your coffee is grown in fair trade plantations, but what about workers' rights on the ship that that carries it for 5 or 6 weeks? And they said, oh no, we can't do that, it's too complicated. That, well, then your fair trade product is not fair trade, because there's a whole part of this coffee's life where the humans involved in carrying it have no protection from you and no kind of validation from you and your fair trade thing. So that was really surprising to me. I hadn't really considered that before, but it just, I mean, it's great that they have fair trade plantations and their workers are paid a good wage and stuff, but what about the Filipinos? What about the seafarers?
Yeah.
What about, what about the other parts of the global supply chain who are absolutely ignored? Even today, that, I mean, I would have thought that things had got a bit better, but then when COVID happened, I mean, it was just appalling that so many seafarers were stuck on their ships for months and months and months and months. And even now, I think with fishing crews, it's so hard for them to come ashore in the US. It's like they have to get a visa that they have to go and be interviewed for, but they're not allowed off the ship, or it's just crazy. And so they just stay on board, and just these simple things of, okay, let's give them a temporary visa, or let's get them off the ship and put them somewhere else. But again, I remember when I was writing 90% and all these, it was the height of Somali piracy, and of course 500 or so seafarers were being held hostage. And I understand why it was kept quiet, because there were negotiations, but that wasn't the only reason. And I remember being really shocked that there was just hardly any media attention towards these people, because there were a few Europeans, but they weren't British and they weren't American until Captain Phillips. And I just found that really shocking. And then I thought, well, that can't happen again. And then exactly the same thing happened again with COVID. Obviously, because everybody's going through a pandemic and everyone's got their own shit to deal with. But there were all these seafarers who didn't go home for like a year or 2 years. And again, hardly any attention except in the shipping trade circles or the seafarer welfare people or that kind of thing. But there wasn't really much attention given to them. So we just let it happen again.
You said, when you've recounted that, you've said, trying to imagine 544 airline workers being held captive, and how much of a fuss that would have made, or truckers.
Yeah.
And so this piece is really unseen. And I think that when you talk about the fair trade aspect, this is really important. When we're shipping everything to and fro, you have a great quote about, shipping Scottish cod to be filleted in China, to be shipped back to Scottish shops and sold back, because it's cheaper. And there's so many examples of that. I recently was reading something about the closing of the toes of socks. It took a while for a sock machine to be made that closed the toes. And so the socks would be knitted in this machine, and then somebody would close the toes. And most of that was done in Fort Payne, Alabama, in the United States. And then they started shipping the socks to Guatemala. And it was 1 penny less per sock to ship them there, to have the toes closed and then shipped back. And I think that it's these kinds of stories that when all of our goods are traversing this space, fair trade can't exist unless we see those people that are moving an an absolutely unfathomable amount of goods back and forth.
And an unnecessary amount of goods.
Yes. Yeah. And that was something else that kind of came up for me as I was thinking about the word waste, which I also really dislike because I think it colors our perception of it as something that it need not be, and how we had this waste that is sort of critical to life, honestly, right? It is what nourishes crops. And I think back to like in England, I know they would bring back bodies, bones home and grind them to put on the fields because they needed phosphorus so badly at one point in the 1820s. And so thinking about how this is really critical to life, but also the amount of waste, actual waste, we ship back and forth, fashion that ends up in landfills, just fast fashion, the Temu and the Shine things that, the actual waste. And I know that at one point in the book, somebody talks about what you're exporting out of Britain, because the container ship that you take is largely empty, is waste and hot air.
Yeah.
And so the sort of dual edge of looking at this one thing that's very critical to life as waste, and this one thing that I think can lend itself to wastefulness.
Yeah.
In the shipping industry.
I mean, I think waste is a really interesting concept because, one person's waste is another person's wealth. And what's considered waste in this country, especially after Brexit, we used to export it because we haven't invested in, for example, residual fuel waste or, any kind of scrap, anything. We didn't invest in the infrastructure to convert that into energy or anything. So we used to just export it to Belgium or Lithuania or wherever. But with Brexit, that's become a lot harder. And so we've ended up probably sending more to landfill. So, but it's not waste. It's only waste because you don't have the facilities to turn it into something else. So that's pretty frustrating. But yeah, a friend of mine has just written a really good book. Now I have to remember the title. I think it's called Wasteland. Which did exactly
Oliver Franklin. Yeah,
Oliver. Yeah, well, I say friend, we're Twitter friends. But so I reviewed that and I found that it was really eye-opening, and I thought I was pretty well read, and I was reading this going, oh my god. I mean, polluting rivers in Ghana with fast fashion scraps, and it's a good book. I highly recommend it if you want to know where your stuff goes and what is done or not done to it.
Yeah, it's an absolutely incredible book. It's something, it's come up time and time again on the podcast, and hopefully eventually he'll come on and talk about it. But I think that it's interesting too, because we ship some of that, right? That waste, the fast fashion that ends up in a river in Ghana. And he has a quote in there that I love, where the people of Ghana will say, "Oh, did the white man die? Because why else would they get rid of all of these clothes?" Right? And they clog up waterways. But again, this is something like we are exporting some of our waste as we import this massive amount of goods, again, from places that are really largely unseen, and the people that are moving those things from place to place go unseen. Whether that's the shippers, or I think some of the factory workers and farmers that are at the beginning of that supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Yeah. And I just think it's really, it's a big piece. And it kind of speaks to one of the things that came up for me as I was reading, was that you talk about interdependence. And I think that, containerization and globalization created this really big interdependence in terms of how we supply one another with goods, and being able to do it in a stacked and organized manner via the shipping container is one thing. But I think that there was also this piece of, we are interconnected in terms of how we begin to approach solutions, like finding people toilets or finding a better solution for menstrual pads. I thought that Padman was one of my favorite aspects of Nine Pints. It was just an absolutely wild and beautiful story, and so that there is this interdependence, not just of how our goods travel to and fro, but also in how we begin to see the toilet or see something like a pad, and how we might begin to find some solutions.
I think, I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting word, interdependence, and I think there's another aspect of it, which is, and particularly looking at sanitation and looking at how you improve getting menstrual products to women and girls who lack them. And one of the things that keeps striking me again and again is that there are always good solutions, and there are always good people with good solutions, but the difficulty is always making them get to scale and be sustainable. And one of the interdependence, it's not, maybe interdependence is not the right word, but they often rest on really banal problems. So, for example, a lot of projects, even if you have a good project that's installing toilets or giving people subsidized toilets or handing out sanitary pads, if it's only got a 3-yearly budget, then what happens at the end of the 3 years? And so many projects, they don't roll on and on. So you do something for 3 years, you've got toilets in this particular area, but you haven't got toilets over, a whole region. And, there are people with brighter minds than me in the world of development who will have been wrestling with this for ages, but it's just such a fundamental obstacle to big solutions, is just this, we need to have a longer term budget. We need to have a 10-year budget, not a 3-year budget or a 5-year budget, or things like, I remember when I was looking at sanitation, sometimes you don't even know who's got responsibility for sanitation between the various departments. So is it education? Is it engineering? Is it the treasury? Is it, and all these, and they've all got a little bit of responsibility, but they're all kind of batting it around, and the solution isn't necessarily to have a minister of sanitation, although that probably would be useful, or a minister for periods. That would be good, actually. But
that would be good.
But I think it's often given as an excuse for not dealing with a problem that can be dealt with probably more easily, because of this kind of bureaucratic dilution of the problem at a particular level of governance. And it's things like that often damage really good ideas and really, really good things that could be amazing, but get hampered by a simple lack of a budget, or the fact that no one's in control, or no one's interested in being in control, or I don't know. I find that frustrating. And
very, very frustrating. And I think that it's a lack of long-term ideas and long-term commitment to implementation, to seeing things through. And I think that in a lot of ways, just as you've said, that what emerges in some of the people that are looking at solutions in both the Big Necessity and like Maruga Padman in the book, then all of a sudden it's these individuals that come forward that are really trying to take on a widespread problem that needs a little bit more of a network and interdependence, to bring us back to where we were, in order for it to be successful in implementation.
Yeah, I was just thinking. Yeah. I was thinking in the Blood book. Actually, I was thinking of and now I've forgotten his name, but he's a surgeon who I talked to about the use of whole blood in blood transfusions, which he was in Somalia for Black Hawk Down, and they used whole blood because they couldn't get any other blood. They just had to basically just draw blood from soldiers. And they found that it worked a lot better. And I was just thinking, I mean, how on earth does that ever go to scale? Because the paradigm is so unquestioned that fractionated blood, where you take blood and you separate it into red blood cells, platelets, plasma, whatever else, cryoprecipitate. Anyway, and and he is really passionate about the fact that whole blood can really be much more beneficial, because what you're doing when you're giving someone a blood transfusion is you're trying to rebuild a product that you've already separated into many parts, and then you're trying to put it back together, and it's obviously it's not going to be as good. And and I just think of him and think, oh my goodness, I mean, how could he possibly come up against fight against the paradigm of something that no one questions, that, you know, red blood cells and fractions are the best way forward, and he's just going to have to keep doing small studies and more studies, and eventually maybe someone will hear him, but I'm not sure I'm not sure if he'll ever have any success, but I really admire him for trying.
Uh, Absolutely, and I think it makes sense that whole blood would be more successful. That would be more something that the body, that we can't take something apart and put it back together and have it have the same the same sort of ineffable, right? There's something in that whole context that matters. And I think, coming back to where we started with that David Foster Wallace quote, I think that part of not seeing the waters that we swim in are these sort of unrecognized paradigms that we don't even begin to question.
Yeah.
And one quote that I've come back to a lot lately on the podcast is a David Graeber quote. And he said, the ultimate hidden truth of the world is that it's something that we make and could just as easily make differently. But I think that to recognize that we are swimming in these waters is kind of a first step into questioning these paradigms. And I think you do an incredible job of that. And then looking at these different contexts in which these paradigms are existing, whether that's open defecation or how blood is used in certain situations, or how girls are treated when they get their periods in places that are not the Western world, and seeing them so that those paradigms can be questioned, which I think is a really difficult thing, because we often just get stuck in, it's just the water that we swim in and can't see.
Yep, true. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think. So I've just been doing a book about fishing and fishes, and one of the interesting paradigms is that as consumers, people think that there is really no shortage of fish. And that is only because there is a global supply chain, and because people don't really understand how fishing works. And so I don't know what it's like in the US, but we romanticize our fishing industry, and it's tiny. It's economically puny. And we romanticize it into this great big thing of, I don't know, it's strange, you know, maritime nation, blah, blah, blah. But
we do the same. I think about Alaskan salmon in particular.
Yep.
The sort of like wild frontier of fish, these free fish in some ways.
Yeah.
I think,
but at least some of the Alaskan fish stocks are in good health. But I think that people think that because there are no gaps on the fishmonger counter, that everything's fine. But what they don't realize is that in the US, you import 90% of your fish. In the UK, we import 80% of our fish. Most industrialized countries import far more fish than they export. And yet we have this whole romanticization about the fishing industry and all this ridiculous rhetoric about bring back our fish. And for a start, they swim. And secondly, you know, how do you bring back our fish? Who's to say that there are fish? Anyway, but the reason that we don't question the paradigm, and the reason that people are not more worried about the fact that wild fish stocks are in such a terrible state is that, or wild fish populations, I should say, as they are animals, not commodities,
Mhm.
is because as a consumer, which is really your only interaction with, is the end state of your interaction with fish as a product, you don't see any gaps. And because your fish has come from, your shrimp has come from Vietnam, or your cod has come from Iceland, or because there is this huge industrialized system behind the fishmonger's counter that you do not see, and that is giving you
Mm.
a skewed interpretation of how things are. And I don't know how it would make any difference if we did know how things were, and we did know that, 90%. I mean, even your shrimp, like Americans eat more shrimp than any other fish product, and um, I'm not sure of the actual percentage, but most of it is imported. Even though you've got, the
Yeah.
Gulf of Mexico shrimpers and Forrest Gump and all that, but your shrimp is imported pretty much, 90%. I mean, 90%. That is quite a huge margin of imported fish. But that's the way the world works. But because, again, there's something that really fascinated me in the fish book, and I don't eat fish. I don't like it. Never have. But for the past few years, I've been going to supermarkets and just standing at the fish counter and looking like a total weirdo, just reading fish packet after fish packet after fish packet. And the labeling of fish is such a theatre that it's an illusion of information, but it's actually,
Mm.
if you drill down into it, and it doesn't take much drilling, you're really not given much information at all. And so you'll get a fish packet that says maybe, okay, this has been caught by, and it'll give you like maybe half a dozen different methods of fishing. And if you know anything about fishing, you'll know that these are vastly different in terms of bycatch, in terms of damage to the environment, in terms of efficiency. And you then need to look up the FAO region of the ocean where your fish has been bought. And, it's just, who's going to do that? Who's going to stand at a fish counter and spend at least 15 minutes trying to figure out whether that's a decent fish to buy? You're going to go on what the packet says. And it's, yeah, I'm so pleased I don't eat fish, because it would just give me a headache, because I would just be so confused by what's good, what's bad. And yeah, I really feel for people who eat fish.
I think that we're in a time of, you use the term illusion of information, right? I think that we just look for these little labels. We don't see, again, it's obfuscation and wanting that clean, smooth, unbroken. And by unbroken, I mean that you don't see gaps in the fish supply at your local fish counter. We want that smooth, unbroken surface of modernity in which to keep things obfuscated, because I think to see sometimes feels too weighty, because then you might have to dive deep into all the chemicals that might be in your menstrual products, or all the different places that blood has been, and how it's put back together. And I think especially, and this is where I've spent most of my life working, is in food supply, looking at food supply chains, and just how those fish are impacted, how those ecosystems are impacted, how the fishermen are impacted, and then how the people that ship are a part of shipping the fish hither and yon are impacted. Feels too much, and to just say wild caught,
Yeah.
and to just have those
Wild
words,
caught.
and to
I
have
love
that be
wild caught. I love that almost as much as what's the other good one? Line caught. Line caught is brilliant, because it's so, to use your word, obfuscating, because you read line caught on a packet of fish and you immediately see a little fisherman with a rod and line off the back of his little boat, or her, but more likely to be him. And that's just nonsense. I mean, when it says line caught, it's like lines a mile long with thousands of hooks on them. It's industrialized. It's not, but they just get away because they can say line caught. What you actually want is pole and line, which is someone with a pole and a line, and pretty benign as fishing goes. But I mean, how are you supposed to know all this stuff? How is anyone supposed to retain all this? There's so much to take on. I understand why people just accept paradigms. I
Yeah,
understand why people
me too.
just accept the fishmonger's counter and but yeah, I don't know where I was
I
going with that, but
I mean, there's almost this, something that you brought up in how we romanticize, right? That we romanticize the fishing industry, that we want to see it as this is a small coastal town, and there's
hardy
just like
fisherman.
a couple guys on a boat, yeah,
Yeah.
and there's a romanticizing of that, and then there's a romanticizing in the language that we use, line caught. I think about this all the time when you pick up eggs or butter, and there's this cute little red farm that we
Yeah.
expect, this sort of romantic idea of what a farm is, and what lies underneath that is a very different story. And I
Mm.
think for those things that we can't romanticize, we almost shut out completely. And the world of toilets and shit and waterborne illness, perhaps being one of those things that just like it can't almost can't wrap our minds around the volume of information that we're exposed to, and so we narcotize or anesthetize or just sort of numb out to it instead, which I am completely sympathetic to. I don't think that
Mm.
there's anything wrong with it per se, but I think that it's those things that we can romanticize, we hide it behind that. And if we can't romanticize goods on a ship in the same way that we romanticize ships of the past,
Mm.
we just kind of block it out.
Yeah. I was just thinking while you were talking about sanitation, and so recently in the UK in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of really, really lively protest about our rivers. And I mean, our public utilities are in an absolutely terrible state. And
Yeah.
they're all owned by hedge funds and they're all in hock to their shareholders, and none of them have got any kind of sense of water and wastewater treatment being a public good. And but that's been the case for a very long time. And for a long time, we have this thing called a combined sewer overflow. So in the UK, our system that was built in the 19th century, and it's the case in some of the US, but not all of it, we have a combined system which is shit and stormwater in the same system.
Mhm.
What that means is that a system can get very easily overwhelmed with population growth, and with a warming world, the system can get very easily overwhelmed with a short, sharp rainstorm. And so there is something called a combined sewer overflow permit, which means that wastewater utility companies in England and Wales, I think, can just discharge untreated sewage into the nearest water body, which they've been doing for years and years and years and years. I mean, if you look at how many CSOs, they've always been a lot, but I think they have increased. But it's, for some reason, when it was going into the ocean, people didn't really get upset about it, even though there is this really great organization called Surfers Against Sewage. Really, really good environmental organization. But it's when it started hitting the rivers and the rivers started really getting damaged by it that I think people just got, I don't know what it was. It's like, okay, yeah, if it goes into the sea, the solution to pollution is dilution. It's really big. It doesn't matter. But the rivers, no, we're not
Mhm.
going to stand for the rivers being. And so somehow that triggered a much, much bigger protest about the terrible
Mm.
state of our wastewater utilities, where years of this happening, but largely elsewhere or largely out of sight. And it was already going in the rivers, but it just probably wasn't as frequent.
Mhm.
But anyway, I'm all in favour. Whatever it took, I'm really glad that it happened, because perhaps we'll get some wastewater utility owners who are actually worthy of running a wastewater utility and a water utility. Because at the moment, I find the UK really remarkable in that it's, because I also have a house in France, so I know that the French do not sell off their national utilities to anyone. And they're very proud of most
Interesting.
of their utilities and infrastructure being French owned, which you would. I mean, it's kind of national security, isn't it, to own your national grid and
Mhm.
your water and your wastewater and your
Mhm.
trains and your electricity board and all that. Whereas the UK, because of Margaret Thatcher, just sold everything off. So I think there's one Welsh-owned wastewater utility, but everything is owned by hedge funds and venture capital, and everything's shareholders, capitalism, privatization, and it's an absolutely sure way to wreck your wastewater utility system. Because obviously, if your priority is dividends, paying dividends to your shareholders, your priority is not reducing CSOs into the local river. So, yeah, it's very hard to fix things when they're this entrenched in. But it's not impossible. It's not impossible to fix them. And
No.
if we had a brave and good government who just said, "All right, we're bringing it all back into national hands. We're nationalising all the water utilities," I think there would be so many people in favour of that. But I don't know that they have the guts to do that.
Now I'm very curious about the U.S. and their utilities and whether or not they're owned by hedge funds. And I think
well, you're offshore. So I've been writing about offshore wind. Sorry to interrupt, but I've been writing about offshore wind because I've been looking at fishing versus offshore wind. And you don't have much offshore wind. Until about a year ago, you only had 5 working turbines. We have 43 wind farms, so we have loads of offshore wind. Pretty much all your offshore wind is owned by foreigners. So it's all Danish and European, because the US has no offshore wind infrastructure for the components or the facilities or anything. So it makes sense that it would be Danish companies. And so I'm guessing that if it's possible to own offshore wind as a foreigner, perhaps the US has actually sold. I don't know the answer, but I hope not. I hope for your sake it hasn't.
Infrastructure is something I've been looking a lot at, and I had I don't know if you're familiar with her work, Deb Chakra, who wrote a book called How Infrastructure Works, just sort of about infrastructure, and I had actually come to it because of the big necessity and how interested I was in Bazalgette and the creation of sewer systems, and you're getting to visit this sort of thing that underpins a way that we flush everything to, and where that's going, and something that you point out is that it could have been dealt with a lot differently, that it didn't have to go into waterways. And I think, to speak to the river pollution, and I know Robert McFarlane is working on a book called "Is a River Alive?" and this sort of idea of giving a personhood to bodies of water in order to better serve them, right?
Which has been done,
I think
hasn't
that
it?
part of it,
it has already been.
I think it has. It has, and different places are working on different components of that. But I think that the difference between the ocean, which we've also, I sat with Helen Chersky and talked a lot about the ocean and how the ocean works, and that we don't see this thing. And you say that same thing, right? And sea blindness. It's something blue that we fly over.
Yeah.
And I think all of a sudden a river brings it to our backyard. And one of my questions for you as we begin to wrap up was absolutely, how do we get people to start seeing things? Because in many ways, I think awareness or seeing is the doorway to changing, reimagining, funding, especially those things that we've relegated to the banal.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a long-winded answer to this.
Please.
So I once, when I was at Colours magazine, and most of the time we wrote like 200-word captions, but we were, what was the issue on? I can't remember. Anyway, so I had to write a long piece, and it was all about attention span and how the human brain works. And during the course of it, I wrote about, there was a New York Times piece, this was a long time ago. I think it was some kind of analysis of what makes people pay attention. And they analysed lots and lots and lots of articles in the New York Times that day, and they found that there was one that was the most popular and that people read to the end, because a lot of people read like halfway down or 2/3 down and then stop reading. I do that. But this one piece, people read it to the end, and the reason was that the piece was about how you find a babysitter. So that was the most resonant piece for people because that was the most useful piece for people. So, and I think, and I'm going to very cack-handedly link that to, for example, what I learned from toilets is that people only found a toilet useful if they had some kind of input, if they had to contribute, that they had some sense of ownership of the toilet. So if they were just gifted, in India, this
Yeah.
happened a lot. If they were just gifted a latrine, it often just ended up being used as a goat shed or a spare room. But if they
Yeah.
had to give something of themselves to this thing, it gave it value. And they would then look after it and maintain it. And I think, and I don't know how that translates to getting people to care about things. And I don't expect people to have the headspace to care about everything. But I think
Absolutely.
you just have to care about what matters to you and what you can control. And if you can modify your lifestyle to make things a little better for, I don't know, I don't know how you're going to do it for the seafarers, but you could, for seafarers, you could just do something simple like support a local seafarer charity, which is giving them Wi-Fi when they come into port. It's really simple. Fish, oh dear, I don't know how you improve. I guess you just have to keep reading. I think it's Monterey Bay Aquarium does a good fish guide or an equivalent of the good fish guide. And but yeah, I don't know the answer. I don't know how to make people care. I think I just try and make things readable, and sometimes it works. Sometimes people write to me and say, "Oh, I changed this. I'm not rinsing out the oil in my sink anymore." Or, I mean, that to me is an absolute win. Just I'm so proud of that one person has stopped pouring oil down the sink. Brilliant. Or, I put the seat down in the toilet, or I don't flush it as much, or any of that. Great. Good. That's my work done then, because if it's just made even it's a marginal gain. And I think there is nothing wrong with marginal gains, because marginal gains add up over time to a big gain. So I guess I told you that was long-winded, but I guess if I have any aim, it is that somebody will get the inspiration to make some kind of marginal gain change, and that would make me very happy.
Oh, I think I love that answer, and I think that marginal gains absolutely matter, and agree completely that we can't see and care about all of these things. I think one of the reasons I've spent a lot of my life working in food is because I think food tugs at it.
Mm,
It tugs at a lot of these different threads because it is something that we sort of see and think about on a daily basis, but it's underpinned by, like we've talked about this, by infrastructure, by shipping, by
mm,
shit. Is all part and parcel of that. But I think that it's small, and my question is always how to get people curious. And I think you've done an incredible job of taking these topics that feel hidden or that we can't quite see the shape of, and making them interesting and compelling and individualized, finding the humans in it that connect us to that sense of story. And to kind of go back to the piece around needing to have a little bit of investment in it, a little bit of skin in the game, right? That a gifted toilet often just becomes an extra room. And I love that you mentioned that a goat shed.
yeah.
But when it's something that you are helping to build or shift, or that you're putting some sort of piece of yourself back in, that is when I think we regain, honestly, a sense of agency,
Mm,
because I think some of these things feel so big that we feel helpless in
mm,
it. And so that agency gives us the investment we need, or the idea that we really can have a piece, that our little marginal steps really do add up.
Yeah. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm all in favour of maximal gains as well. I would happily renationalise the whole water utility system in the UK.
Yeah.
No bother. And I would happily close the high seas to fishing and ban all fuel subsidies for fishing trawlers and boats. Yeah, I'd do that. Those would be really big maximal gains, but I don't know how to do that. So,
yeah.
But yeah, I have big ambition.
Well, and I mean, I think that it's just imagining that it's possible. That's part of working towards it.
True.
And I agree. I think those things should happen. And it's pointing at it and saying, this is what it would affect. Should we make the decision to do that, and showing people that possibility in the first place?
Yeah.
I know we're close on time, but I want to thank you, and I want to thank you for having this kind of big overarching conversation. I have all these quotes and all of these bits and bobs from each book, and I really enjoyed this process of going back and reading everything together, and just I really do appreciate that you illuminate so much of what feels like a necessity that is yet unseen, or the ubiquitous and unseen. And
thank you. That is really kind of you, because I'm still working on the fish book, and any author who's working on a book goes a bit crazy and forgets that they can write, and forgets that people read, and or people might read if you're lucky. And it's really nice to hear that, and that you have read my books twice. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I read The Big Necessity and 90% twice.
Wow.
And then read A Life Removed and 9 Pints once. But I just think that they're amazing. It changed my life, and it changed my life. It changed how I see things. It just illuminated something. It spurred so much of the explorations on this podcast. I mean, we've been exploring infrastructure, and been exploring some of the externalities of shipping, and really looking at globalization and sort of the sort of Mark Levinson-esque, impetus of globalization by the creation of this box. And it really did. It set me off in a totally different trajectory, and really has formed a lot of what I've been looking at, and how I've sort of continually asked myself the question of, like, how can I see the water that I'm swimming in? What is that thing?
So that's a good note to end on. Let's all look at the water.
Yeah. Let's all look at the water. Yeah, I think that's perfect. I'll have links for everybody on where to find you, and just thank you.
You're very welcome.
Well,
thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Mind, Body, and Soil podcast. If what you found resonated with you, may I ask that you share it with your friends, or leave us a rating and review wherever you listen to podcasts. This act of reciprocity helps others find Mind, Body, and Soil. If you're looking for more, you can find us at groundworkcollective.com and at Kate_Kavanaugh, that's KATE_KAVANAUGH on Instagram. I would like to give a very special thank you to China and Seth Kent of the band All Right, All Right for the clips from their beautiful song Over the Edge from their album The Crucible. You can find them at All Right, All Right on Instagram and wherever you listen to music.